Chapter 1. The Plan is Ruined. 6 weeks. Her leg was splinted, and she wasn't supposed to walk on it for 6 weeks. "I know what you're thinking," Grandfather said, rubbing his chin. Well, Yavik did know someone who could read minds. His grandfather was not that person. Yet Yavik was reasonably certain that the older man did know what he was thinking. "We can't wait 6 weeks, Yavik said. His grandfather nodded, not surprised. "Can you be persuaded to wait just a day or two while we see if someone else can go with you? Lord Boggs likely would." "We made it here by ourselves," Yavik said. He turned over the journey in his mind. It had been difficult, but they were better prepared this time, much better prepared. When Yavik and his sisters left Wisherton, they had to pack in secret and didn't know what lay ahead of them. This time they had maps. This time their grandparents had helped them pack for 2 weeks. This time the journey would be the easy part. Getting their mom and dad out of Wisherton, which was the goal of the journey, would be the challenge. Yavik didn't see how it would necessarily help to bring another person who didn't have a clue how to do it. "We can go back without help too," he said. "I don't doubt that," Grandfather said. "This setback only makes me want to pause, to make sure we consider options." What options? Yavik was getting impatient. He hated being separated from his parents, especially when they knew so little. He'd initially agreed to stay in Brelin for a week, only to plan and to give his sisters time to recover. Then their grandmother had wanted to come with them. She couldn't leave before the autumn festival, which generated much of the yearly income for the farm. The festival meant staying 2 weeks instead of 1, but she promised to be ready the very next day. Now, Grandmother Sever had broken her leg cleaning up afterwards. They'd waited a week for nothing. Yavik was seriously impatient. If they waited 6 more weeks for her to heal, they would likely run into snow. That would slow them down and make the journey more dangerous. "We'll leave in the morning as planned, whether you approve or not." Yavik tried to measure his voice to sound determined rather than defiant. Grandfather rested an arm on the table between them and leaned towards Yavik. A similar determination reflected in his eyes that were the exact same shade of green. "Will you leave the younger girls with us?" Yavik considered that idea. His first thought was how much Lolly would hate it. Lolly was the youngest of his 3 sisters. She had a knack for acting first and thinking second, if at all. It was a trait that drove careful Yavik crazy. But she was tenacious and possibly more eager to return to Wisherton than anyone else. She had big plans. Lolly intended to break into Wisherton through the enormous, heavily guarded wall and bring their parents out. She planned to say farewell to friends she hadn't been able to see before leaving the first time. She planned to find Thames again, who they'd met on their journey from Wisherton to Brelin. She planned to find his family, too, and bring them all safely to Brelin. The more Yavik thought about his 8-year-old sister and the plan she had no clue how to execute, the more it seemed that perhaps his grandfather was right to suggest she stay behind. The older man appeared to sense Yavik softening to the idea. "We can tell Lolly and Samtree that they're needed here, to tend to their injured grandmother," he said. "That could take some sting out of leaving them." Yavik nodded slowly. Samtree was a little more than a year older than Lolly, but far more timid. She might actually be grateful to stay put. "Okay," he said. "Just Sever and I will go. Lolly will be mad, but I hope all will be forgiven when we return with Mom and Dad." Yavik spoke with confidence he didn't feel. The plan depended on a lot of things going right. He also had no idea how, after 2 weeks of talking and planning, he was going to withstand the tears when he told Lolly she couldn't come. He knew there'd be tears. In fact, Lolly was already crying. She sat out of sight, listening to her brother and grandfather talking about leaving her behind. She didn't eavesdrop on purpose. She had been on her way down to say good-night to her grandfather. A cat was sitting on the top of the stairs, and she sat to pet him briefly. Hushed voices rose to her and the cat in the still house. The intention to leave her and Samtree hit her before she knew what she was hearing. Light from the candles in the room below flickered around her feet while her emotions swirled inside. She wanted to go with her brother and sister. They needed her. She knew she could help. Somehow, she could help. Yavik waited until the morning to inform 2 of his younger sisters that they would not be coming on the journey. He told Sever first, the oldest of his sisters. She was 12, but it wasn't her few extra years that made bringing her make sense. Sever had the gift of strength. She could lift boulders and break trees in half. The gift had been useful on the first trip, and would be helpful on the way back. It would particularly help getting past the wall, but only Yavik would go inside. People of Wisherton feared gifts. The Say siblings had left Wisherton to prevent Sever being sentenced to death for having one. The children now stood in front of their grandparents' skinny house in the morning sunshine. The house was 3 stories tall, but had only 1 room on each floor. The front of the house was narrower than the side, and it towered behind them as Yavik explained the new plan. Yavik and Sever Say stood facing their younger sisters in the house. Lolly and Samtree Say looked almost as alike as 2 sisters could, without being identical. They had dark hair with a red tint. Though Samtree's eyes were green and Lolly's were brown, they were the same shape, with the same thick fringe of lashes. They both had straight hair that skimmed their shoulders in cute bobs. Their reaction to the new plan was very different, and neither could be described as cute. Samtree stomped on Yavik's foot before she fled into the house. Sever was surprised by it because she expected a drawn-out farewell with lots of tears and hugs. Yavik preferred having his foot stomped on by someone half his size to a drawn-out farewell with lots of tears and hugs. Lolly's reaction more closely lined up with expectations. She stared hard at her brother while her mouth worked to open and close, producing no words. It looked as though she was trying to decide exactly how angry she wanted to be. "It makes sense for you to stay and help Grandfather," Yavik said. Their grandfather had weak joints that needed frequent rest, which was why no one suggested he escort the children. "He didn't need help when Grandmother was coming with us," Lolly retorted. "But now he has to work the farm and tend to Grandmother." "She doesn't need tending," Lolly rolled her eyes. "She has crutches." That might have sounded callous, except that Yavik was certain a broken leg would barely slow Lolly down. Why would she expect it to get in anyone else's way? "You can be a help to both of them," Yavik said. "I want to help you!" Lolly turned her eyes to her sister. "Severa, will you let me come?" Severa sighed and looked between her siblings. Lolly was attempting to channel her anger into pleading, but it wasn't working very well. Her request came out softly. Her eyes chased it with an expression that clearly said, "or else." Yavik had both hands on his head, fingers spread, with dark red hair shooting up between them. It was never difficult to tell when he was frustrated. Sever was torn on who should get her sympathy. She kind of wanted Lolly and Samtree to come for their company. She kind of wanted them to stay behind so she didn't need to worry about keeping them safe. But it was their grandparents' idea for the younger girls to stay, and Sever chose to respect that. "I'm sorry," she said to Lolly. "We'll come back as soon as we can." "As soon as you can? As soon as you can?" Lolly's voice rose towards a scream as she repeated the words, "I want to come!" "No." Yavik picked up his backpack and pushed his arms through the straps. He'd set it down because he figured there would be hugs. Lolly was looking more likely to run away than hug anyone. He almost wished she'd just stomp on his other foot and get it over with. Sever bent and gave Lolly a quick squeeze while she continued to glare at Yavik over Sever's shoulder. "Goodbye, Lolly. We'll miss you." She picked up her own supplies, a bag bigger than she was. Sever's words had sincerity, and Yavik nodded in agreement as he waved and began to walk backwards. He wanted Lolly to say goodbye. She kept glaring at him as though the discussion was not over. But he and Sever were leaving. The discussion was over. Lolly turned suddenly and walked to the house. Yavik and Sever turned as well. Leaving made Yavik sadder than he expected. He suddenly wanted to reconsider and take all his sisters with him. Then he heard Lolly slam the door. She opened it and slammed it again, and again, and again. The trip was expected to take 5 or 6 days there, as many back, and however long it took to get their parents out. It would be far longer than Yavik had ever been away from Lolly or Samtree. He would absolutely miss them. But the racket Lolly was making at the moment made him smile, and that helped. Sever walked down the dirt path that had already become familiar in their short time in Brelin. She knew the family who lived in the first house they passed, and looked forward to seeing their friend Peppo on the way out of town. If they could succeed in getting their family back together, this would make a nice new home. Peppo's family lived in the last house. It was spaced farther than the others. He helped look after the herd of Fuels. The soft animals had grown on Sever since she'd arrived. She could almost make the low growling sound Peppo used to call the animals to him. But she wouldn't do it if anyone else might hear. She simply watched the herd as it came into sight. Peppo waved happily as he saw Yavik and Sever approaching. He was also 14, older than Yavik by only 2 months. Peppo wore a long robe with a belt like most in Brelin, while Yavik stuck to the tunics and pants he'd brought from Wisherton. Sever liked the Brelin robes and had accepted a few from her grandmother to blend in. She'd returned to her old clothes for travel, though. She waved back at Peppo. One of the fuels took advantage of Peppo's distraction. It lowered its head and rammed it against the side of his leg. He stumbled and nearly fell over, but he smiled at the animal, as though it was a rambunctious toddler. When they were close enough to speak without shouting, which Fuels did not like, Peppo said, "Today's the day, huh? Where's everyone else? I thought your grandmother was going with you." "Grandmother had an accident," Sever said. "She broke her leg." "Oh, that's too bad." Peppo looked at their heavy bags. "You're still going? Without Lolly and Samtree?" Yavik nodded. Boy, was Lolly upset when she found out. "But I hope we can go faster without them. Be back faster." "I'll pray for that," Peppo said. "And you'll enter Brelin by our field. You promised." "Of course." Sever held out her hand and patted a Fuel as it nudged her legs and moaned quietly, "The animals will be calling us home." The three of them stood looking at each other until the silence grew awkward. Have a good trip." Peppo tried to smile and turned towards the horizon when he couldn't manage it. He had voiced his doubts about their success, the same doubts Yavik had, but Yavik had never said out loud how impossible their task might be and couldn't fully forgive Peppo. They all knew it. The Say children had left Wisherton in pursuit of a similarly impossible task. At the same time they discovered it was impossible, they found their long-lost grandparents and turned the mission into a different sort of success. There would be no satisfying alternative this time. They would either escape Wisherton a second time with their mom and dad, or they would forever regret the failure. Yavik thanked Peppo for his well wishes with only a nod. Sever gave him a quick hug that turned Peppo's face about 15 shades of red. That gave Yavik an excuse to turn away and begin the real journey. They exited Brelin at the edge of the fuel farm. Rolling hills stretched in front of them, mostly green with brown patches from the recent cooler weather. The sparse trees had sparse leaves. They had dropped most of those leaves quickly, which now crumbled occasionally under Yavik and Sever's feet. The soft noise of the leaves replaced any talking as Yavik led, though they walked side by side. He had 3 different maps of the region, and consulted them only in his memory, for he had studied them relentlessly. They would walk east for about 2 days before they hit the first landmark, a small river. Yavik squinted against the sun. These first 2 days would be the most boring part of the journey, and he was fine with that. As a person who avoided surprises and uncertainty, he was happy to relax his mind with thoughts of expected boredom. Chapter 2. The new plan is ruined.